those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the views of CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, CNN, or MSNBC, or Al Jazeera, or anyone else that you could imagine.
Hi, this is Scott Clark.
Well, shouldn't we activate the cone of silence?
Hodgkins,
Yes, sir.
activate the cone of silence.
Cone of silence?
With the Heidelcast, the broadcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This is episode 68 for the week of Sunday, April 13th, 2014. The Heidelcast is a service of heidelblog.net. Contact us there or on Twitter at @RScottClark. Send us a message, and we may use it in a future broadcast. Catch all the episodes at heidelblog.net or subscribe in iTunes or another podcast app such as Podcruncher. Click on the Heidelcast icon on the HB homepage to get the 411.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
This is a follow-up to episode 65 on science. It's widely thought that science, the modern study of nature, is the product of the rejection of Christianity, as if science and Christianity are naturally at odds. As part of this narrative, it is said that Christianity is anti-intellectual and disinterested in nature, as if it were backwards and ignorant. In this narrative, it's the Renaissance that gave us the beginnings of science, and it was the Enlightenment that really pushed things forward. Heiko Oberman, the great historian, argued, however, that it was a particular school of late medieval Christian theologians who were a great part in the advance of both the natural sciences and theology. Subordinating speculation to experience freed physics from the confining grip of metaphysical systems that transcend experience. Once experience becomes experiments, modern science was born. And it was nominalism, not humanism, that paved the way. And I would add it was Christians who published Copernicus' work in the early 16th century. Johannes Kepler was a Protestant, as was Tycho Brahe. We could also mention Galileo and Descartes and Pascal and Newton. They all believed their theorizing to be a way of defending the Christian faith. There have been a number of believing scientists in the 20th and 21st centuries, and one of my favorites is Michael Polanyi, who died in 1976. Dr. Todd Pedler is a Christian, and he's a scientist. He's associate professor of physics in Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. He holds a Ph.D. in physics from Northwestern University and has done postdoctoral research at Cornell University. He's the recipient of a number of grants and is widely published in refereed academic journals. In other words, unlike Bill Nye,
the Science Guy,
and Ken Ham, he is a scientist.
Science.
Hi, Todd, and welcome to the Heidelcast.
Hi, Scott. Well, it's good to be here.
Well, how cold is it right now in Decorah, Iowa?
Well, it's 37, so it's a far cry from what it was a few weeks ago. We're still flirting with 1, 2, 3 degrees.
Well, if it's any comfort to you, I almost didn't wear my sandals this morning.
Small comfort.
It probably isn't much comfort. Well, first of all, tell us a little bit about your research. What kind of a scientist are you? I said that you're a physicist, but what kind of physics do you research?
Right. Well, my research, the entirety of my career now, goes 25 years back, is in elementary particle physics. So we study interactions among fundamental particles, quarks that make up the proton and neutron of normal matter that we're used to thinking about. We're aiming to understand the structure of matter and how it holds together.
So this is stuff that most of us can't see.
Well, most of us can't see, although we can see protons and neutrons, or large collections thereof. But quarks and such are subatomic, so it's pretty hard to see them.
So most of us, as a practical matter, on a day-to-day level, live in a sort of Newtonian world, right? We understand apples hitting us on the head. That makes sense. But the stuff that you're talking about seems, I'm not saying that it is, but to laity, it seems a little Gnostic.
It can feel that way, yeah. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the things we study, though, is that we're looking at the elementary interactions between these fundamental particles, and those same interactions are what hold nuclei together, and ultimately, if you delve into electromagnetism, they hold atoms together into molecules, and molecules that are assembled into things like you and me. So there is a trajectory by which we can project from what we study at the fundamental level that then manifests itself in things that we see on an everyday basis.
In episode 65, I mouthed off about science, and at least one respondent said, well, clearly Clark has no idea what he's talking about, because anybody who knows science knows that there are, in this case he was making the case that there are these esteemed, published, reputable young earth scientists. He wasn't defending Bill Nye the Science Guy, but he was defending Ken Ham, or at least Ham's right to hold his view. But my perception is that most folks who are doing science at the professional academic level probably don't think of the universe anyway as being 6,000 years old. What do you make of that kind of claim? Well, you have your scientists and I have my scientists, and now we're having a turf war, a gang fight between the scientific Bloods and the Crips.
Well, so largely that's a debate that I don't ever enter into with the work that I do. But ultimately, science has to rest on evidence. Evidence needs to be presented and, of course, interpreted. So there is a degree to which I guess the complainant is right. People do interpret evidences differently, but building of one of the things that I think is criticized most heavily among those of Ken Ham's fellowship of scientists, as it were. One of the things that gets criticized is, do they propose models that are testable? Do they propose ideas that will then bear more experimental fruit? I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of science in general, is that observation leads to model building, and model building leads to predictions, and predictions lead to verification or falsifiability, in to use Karl Popper's term, philosopher of science. And so, most of the scientific world would have very little to say that's positive about those who in the popular view among scientists, I'm speaking, have a model that they're trying to fit everything into, as opposed to building a model out of observation.
A minute ago, I talked about the apparent Gnosticism of late modern physics, because it's looking at things that most of us don't directly experience with our senses. And one of the concerns that I've had for a while now is that there is a kind of cultural Gnosticism, particularly I think among millennials, where they really don't believe their senses. And so I've been saying to students, the world was made to be known and we were made to know it. And our senses certainly are affected by sin, and our perceptions are not perfect, but it seems to me as I read Scripture that Scripture assumes that our senses are generally reliable, and that we can know things to be true. Now, our interpretations of that sense experience, as you say, are complicated, and we do get things wrong. But if we go around denying our sense experience, then it seems to me we've fallen into a sub-Christian view of the way the world works and the way that we're meant to relate to it. And I say all that to say this. One of my long-term concerns about so-called creation science, young earth science, is that the message I get from them is, well, yes, it seems like it takes billions of years for light particles to reach us, if that's even the right way to put it. But really, that's an appearance. It's not a reality. And so that strikes me as being a little bit Gnostic as well.
I think you're onto something there. It is. I think it's possible to construct a model where, one might be able to build a model. I've read some work that makes reference to to the age discrepancy, that does say it's mere appearance, and I think you can get rid of that immediately because it is, as you say, it's denying the phenomenon. I mean, it's not even dealing with the phenomenon in many ways, and that's really not scientific. But on the other hand, I've also heard, not read, but I've heard that there are some models that people have had to have constructed that would allow for a shorter apparent age. I mean, the age question is very complicated. Age from starlight is really a complicated matter. But there are some ways, I think, where one could faithfully work scientifically with such a model. But again, you'd have to build a model that could make predictions. And really, if you're going to be faithful as a scientist in your craft, you have to, again, I've said it before already, you have to build it around observation. You have to build what you do around observation and testing of models. And I just don't hear that in some of what I read, particularly of the kind of thing that you have brought up.
One of the topics that I brought up in the broadcast in episode 65 is the question of professionalism. I remember attending meetings of a creation science association in the Midwest, and I attended for a year or two, I suppose, and they even foolishly gave me an opportunity to speak to them about Van Tillian presuppositional apologetics. And as I sat with them for a few months before I ever spoke to them to get to know them and get a sense of how they were going at things and what their concerns were. And I noticed that there was a pattern of finding people with some kinds of credentials and hauling them in front of the group, whether live or by video, and then having this person speak about things that were pretty well beyond their professional capacity. I think one fellow was a dentist. I'm not sure. And was talking about the age of the earth and evolution and all of those sorts of things. I understand why people do that sort of thing because they're afraid, they're concerned, they want to uphold the truth of the faith and Scripture. And yet when we do those sorts of things, it seems to me it doesn't really advance the intellectual credibility of the faith or of Christians generally. So as a professional, how do you sort these things out? I mean, surely people must come to you and say, Dr. Pedler, validate my theory.
I have had some some experience with that, and usually what I will say is exactly along the lines of which you propose. If it's not within my bailiwick, I'll be willing to give some general critiques, but I'm not going to be competent to address certain issues with they came to me as an authority. Well, I better have the authority in the realm in which they want me to comment. And if I don't, my words aren't worth a whole heck of a lot. So other than generally as an educated scientist, I can speak broadly to some areas and what have you. I think what happens within the creation science community is that an echo chamber of sorts is built, and the community tends to be very small and tends not to be open to much, if any, investigation from anyone who might disagree. And again, there's another hallmark of science. Science needs to be open to scrutiny, or it's not really authentically science. So not only do you have to work with models that are testable and are in principle falsifiable, you need to be able to open the gates of information, as it were, to other eyes that are outside your own group. If I may treat creation scientists as a group, that may or may not be completely fair, because I know there are disagreements among creation scientists about various things. But the danger there really is the danger of a bunch of people speaking to one another without that open availability of outside scrutiny. Another of the things that you mentioned in the podcast that I think is maybe inching, if not inching, maybe leaping or lurching down this road is climate science. There are, in some ways, unquestionable things that are held out as irrefutable. That starts to be a problem too from a scientific perspective.
Well, now people are being censured for even raising questions. I read last night in a British newspaper that there's a move in the UK essentially to require that publishers get permission, or writers, news reporters, get permission in order to even interview people who might raise questions about the quote-unquote orthodoxy of climate science, which strikes me as extraordinarily narrow-minded, bigoted, and unscientific.
Yeah, it very much is, and it's concerned me for a very long time that there are all kinds of things wrapped up in climate science. Of course, it is far wider than simply concerns about the scientific data, but when alternative understandings are denied up front, where hypotheses are denied without even openness to testing them, there's something going on there that's not kosher.
The minute a scientist says, I won't test your hypothesis, I know a priori it couldn't be, then he's really committed to something other than science, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it is. It's frightful. I know a little about this. I don't know. I'm obviously not a climate scientist. I'm not even an atmospheric scientist. So I need to be measured with what I have to say. But when I look at what is publicly available, and I know that the models which are used to describe what's going on with the climate system don't take into account, if at all, some of the bigger drivers of atmospheric gases and temperature moderation and so forth, namely the oceans, I have very little faith in what they conclude. And people are treated with much derision when they raise the point that the models are incomplete and potentially woefully incomplete. Indeed, something other than science seems to be holding sway there in that community.
Everybody has a model, and so all of these models are theoretical constructs that are all subject to criticism.
They should be, yeah.
If we're really being honest, if we're really seeking the truth, and if we're not simply carving out a position for political, economic, social, societal, what gain or advantage in whatever sphere, if we're really seeking the truth, then everybody's model has to be subject to criticism and has to be able to withstand scrutiny. Otherwise, we're really not talking about an intellectual inquiry or endeavor anymore. We're talking about something else.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Which gets me to this whole business of consensus. One of the issues I raised in episode 65 is this question of consensus. Well, there's a consensus of scientists who say, and then that's supposed to quell all dissent. And of course, as a historian, I can think of lots of consensuses that don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how do you navigate that?
Well, one has to look when consensus is used as a shut up phrase, which it is. You obviously are led to question what is meant by consensus in the first place, and B, how is that consensus discerned? And both of them are problematic in this case. What does consensus mean? Well, consensus means that we all agree on something that we haven't actually studied, oftentimes. And that sounds to me like a a problematic definition of consensus. How does one measure consensus? As far as I'm aware, the 97% figure or whatever number you'd like to quote comes from a data mining operation where papers were looked through for words that would indicate agreement or disagreement, and other people have come to different conclusions about the level of consensus.
And that's the way, as a teacher, I always read student papers. I set up a program and I run it to see if they're using keywords, and then I determine their intent.
Right, and so if they're in conformity with your desired set of keywords, then they get the A that they've been hoping for.
That's kind of a bizarre way to read a paper, it seems to me. Usually when a student submits a paper to me, I start at the beginning and I look at the introduction, and then I look at their thesis sentence. And they know in my classes they'd better have one,
yes,
or else.
Mine too.
And then I evaluate the arguments and the evidence to see whether they've made their case in defense of their thesis, which doesn't really work very well if all you're doing is scanning the document electronically looking for keywords.
Yeah, and that's so is there a general consensus? I think probably there is. But there are lots of, one might, I guess a third question I might ask about the usage of the term consensus is, why is there a consensus? Is there a consensus because 5,000 independent climate scientists have conducted their own experiments and tested their own models? Or is there consensus for some nefarious reason? Now, I'm not claiming that there is, but, is there suppression of alternative views and alternative models? And I don't know the answer to that question. I have suspicions, but at least to some level, some things are certainly suppressed. I know that investigators have difficulty getting funding if they're going to propose particular tests.
Well, that's a huge point, because that happens in my discipline all the time. People describe, for example, the Reformation as a modern epoch in order to get funding, because it's much more difficult to get funding for something that is deemed pre-modern. And so if we use the right nomenclature, then we can get the funding we need to support our research. And all of that tends to affect adversely, in my opinion, the outcome of the research.
Yeah, it really can. And I don't know if there's a concerted effort or not, and I don't want to sound as though I'm convinced that there is.
I'm not suggesting that it's concerted or. Yeah. I just think it's structural. Yeah. I think the way the system is built leads people to talk a certain way, and it creates an expectation.
Right. Well, it's very much like people seeking tenure at a university. Before they've got tenure, they're likely to fall in line pretty well with what they know the expectations are. And won't necessarily really push boundaries that, as academics, they really ought to be. And so I do think something like that is occurring, intentional or otherwise. I really don't care, but it does impact the value of the scientific conclusions that are drawn when particular assumptions are made. Let's take the case of, again, modeling temperature. When particular assumptions are made about the level of sensitivity of the climate system to CO2 concentration or something, when those expectations are made and laid down as input parameters to models, that means all the models are going to come, at least to the effect that to the degree that parameter is important. They're all going to say the same thing, and they do. So how artificial is the consensus? That concerns me some. And the last point, really, I guess I would make is that science isn't democratic. It's not about who gets the most votes. It never has been.
Which is a really important point, right? I mean, because we live in a culture since the 1820s that has highly valued democracy with a lowercase d. from the 1820s, we became increasingly influenced by some of the same ideas that fueled the French Enlightenment and other sort of radical, leveling, democratic ideas, again, lowercase d, which makes us value head counting. But when you're trying to figure out what the truth is, counting heads is a terrible way to do it.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things I often, when I'm talking about this, I will point to Einstein. I'll point to the quantum mechanical revolution as a time at which there was great consensus about the way the world worked. And it took a few brave individuals to say, hey, wait a minute, there are problems here that we need to investigate, and here are some ideas about what may really be the case. And ultimately their views won the day. Now, in science, no one ever wins the day ultimately. You just propose a better model that more closely corresponds to what is observed, and you're in the lead in some sense. The finish line is never really crossed.
So it's always tentative.
That again, humility and tentativeness about one's conclusions is again a classic hallmark of what science really ought to be.
One of the things that you and I discussed as we were getting ready for this interview is the difference between science and scientism. So help us understand the difference between those two approaches to understanding and interpreting the natural world.
Sure. Well, so science is a means of acquiring knowledge about natural processes in the natural world. And if you go beyond drawing conclusions about the natural world using testable ideas that are tested by application of evidentiary tests, where you do experiments or you observe things. It's kind of hard to do astronomical experiments, but you can make observations that are repeatable and testable. You involve a community who criticize what you do, leading to more understanding and further research, perhaps proposing of alteration of models or new models. It's a cyclical process of building up information, building up our understanding of natural things. And science naturally is, sorry, pardon the pun, is bounded. There are things about which science really is not competent to speak. And that's where the division lies. Scientism is a commitment, a philosophical commitment, that basically says that science is the only way of revealing knowledge about anything. And any attempt to claim knowledge that does not come from an empirical experimental process is a false claim. And what further happens with those who I would argue are devoted to scientism is that they claim competence to judge all things. So competence to judge questions of, for instance, the existence of God. Science can't go there if science is going to be true to what science ought to be. Science rules out exploration of the supernatural, if you will, because it's really supposed to be concerned about natural processes and natural things, entities, and ought not to be thinking about ultimate questions like those of the existence of God and good and evil and so forth. So scientism, because of the rise of this technological society that we're in, scientism has really impacted both culture in terms of individual people and groups, but also culture in terms of even the humanities. If you look at the way the humanities are studied, often there's a pretended scientificness about it, and I think that comes from the same root of a commitment, knowing or unknowing, to scientism. So again, the difference really is science is a practice by which we derive knowledge about natural processes. scientism really is a philosophy of life and the world that claims universal competence of science to judge all matters of truth.
So it's really the difference between control, authority, and power on the one hand, and the quest for understanding things as best we can on the other. Honest inquiry versus control. And science, as you're describing it, is committed to studying what in theology we call the ordinary providence of God. You're not really able to study the extraordinary providences of God, the special providences of God, the redemptive providences of God, the what we sometimes call the supernatural, because by definition those things are, to put it mildly, difficult to explore.
Well, indeed, they're out of bounds. They're simply out of bounds. And when scientists, it's amazing to me to hear scientists claim that you name the discovery, I don't care, disproves the existence of God, when at the same time they'll complain about religious questions being raised in the public sphere. That they will argue that God can be disproven but not invoked. It just seems to me to be it's an evidence of where their hearts lie, I suppose.
You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, indeed not. Absolutely not. I've heard scientists criticize certain studies as unscientific. Again, I guess I'm repeating myself, because they've invoked God in some way, but then they'll turn around immediately and say, well, God is clearly not. There is no God. It's a failure of science. It's a failure of logic. It's proving a universal negative. There's all kinds of issues that belie, other problems.
You're listening to the Heidelcast, and we're talking to Dr. Todd Pedler, who is Associate Professor of Physics at Luther College. Todd, before we go on, I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about some of the online endeavors in which you're involved, because you are a veteran of the Internet.
A veteran, in a manner of speaking. It's interesting that you called at the time that you did about speaking with you on your podcast, because as it turns out this afternoon, I am joining a panel of 3 Christian humanists on their program, the Christian Humanist Podcast, in which all 3 of these gentlemen are English professors and Christians, and they explore issues of the academy, primarily speaking in terms of the humanities, philosophy, literature, and so forth. And they've decided to interview 3 of us who are scientists, practicing scientists who are Christians, about what we do. That is in a lead-up to a program that we will start in the fall, which we're going to call the Book of Nature, where 3 of us are going to explore issues of science and talk about the practice of science, the conclusions science draws. Again, I'm sure we will definitely tackle scientism, and a wide variety of things from the perspective of Christians practicing as academic scientists. So that will be something in the fall. But the Christian Humanist Podcast is really an excellent program, and you can find it on iTunes and so forth. I've enjoyed interacting over the past year or so with these 3 guys about their programs. Yeah.
When you say humanist in this context, you're not talking about the evil secular humanists who are seeking to take over the world. You're talking about humanists in the old-fashioned sense, the 16th century, 15th century sense of scholars who are committed to the liberal arts.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's Erasmus. It's folks like him. It's John Calvin, for that matter. It's the old sense of the word. They make it very clear what what they're talking about. One of their opening programs was devoted solely to that question. But yeah, it's the product of human endeavor in the arts of various stripes. Yeah, really great discussions they have.
You're a Christian and you're a scientist, and it's complicated to say Christian scientist because you're not a follower of Mary Baker Eddy.
Right.
So there's that the terminological problem. But as a Christian who is a scientist, you live, it seems to me, or you might live, I guess I shouldn't prejudge the answer, in sort of two different worlds simultaneously. How do you navigate that middle space, as it were? Or maybe there isn't any such thing. Are you the object of suspicion, for example, by some in the scientific guild, and are you the object of suspicion by some who are concerned about or suspicious of the scientific guild?
Well, I think the answer is yes. I mean that both sides do tend to want to grab exclusive rights to anyone who might be in the academic arena, and I think one of the things that I can do in the roles, plural, that I hold is try to speak between, try to serve as an intermediary between those who are concerned as Christians that science somehow is a threat, and those who are concerned as scientists that Christianity, and indeed oftentimes any kind of religious claim is a threat to acting with integrity as a scientist. Both of those populations exist. Both of them occasionally crop up in interactions that I have with people. And I oftentimes will discuss, fears that they have, one way or the other, but also address with them the mere fact that really it's impossible to posit a hard and fast division between those two things. Sometimes I'll talk about the history of science and early philosophy of science, which absolutely, as you mentioned in the intro, were hand in hand. I mean, if you look at all of the achievements from, let's say, the 16th century on, and talk about who was making those observations and who was funding those experiments and those studies, very often Christians are heavily involved. Kepler is a great example. Michael Faraday is a great example. It is, there's a conflict largely because of Andrew Dickinson White, right? And I've forgotten the title of his book now, The Great War Between Christianity and Science or whatever. I think it's just false. And so I often do have to talk about really the bottom line is it's unreasonable to expect a scientist to shelve his commitment to Christ or to whatever faith system he might subscribe to, because we're not bifurcated people, right? We are whole people, and everything in some sense informs everything else. I often, because I teach at a Lutheran college, I have the opportunity to go back to the Freedom of the Christian from Luther, and speak about the goodness of pursuit of the study of the natural world, or the goodness of the study of law, or other things that people might be interested in speaking about as a Christian. And doing a job with integrity is to be honored as a Christian, and I try my best to do that.
You teach at a Lutheran college, but your own theological commitments are Reformed, right?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Just to get that out there so that there isn't any confusion. Not that there's anything wrong with being a Lutheran. I'm not suggesting that, at least not here in this context in the course of this discussion. Finally, as we draw this to a close, at the outset, I mentioned that one of my favorite writers on some of these questions is Michael Polanyi. And one of the things I appreciate about his work is that he particularly in personal knowledge, goes through and essentially blows up a series of really important, or adds a layer of complication to a series of really important foundational modern scientific experiments, in which he says, well, in your textbook, you read about this experiment, and you were told that it means this. Well, let me tell you, I knew that guy, and I was there, and here's the stuff they don't tell you in the textbook. And the point of it all isn't to say science is bunk, but it is to say people do science, and they do science in a particular context. And they make decisions, and there's an inevitably subjective element, as we've, I think, been saying all along, in the selection of data, in the evaluation of data, and in the construct of models by which data is interpreted. So he's one of the guys who helps me. Who helps you to think about science and your faith and how all that fits together?
Yeah, well, if I might, I can point to a couple of people who I think are really, really helpful. And again, part of this, I think, derives from my own theological perspectives. But, Herman Bavinck wrote a series of essays on science and religion and so forth.
Which is in print and which is available at Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've drawn a lot of really good just meditation on the practice of science as a person of faith from that work. Vern Poitras, Redeeming Science, is another book, Crossway published. He's got some really good thoughts there. There are a couple of professors at Covenant College in Georgia who wrote a volume called Science and Grace, which are reflections again on working as a scientist and as a Christian. So those three are ones that come to me right away. But also, quite frankly, I find a lot of use in even going back to thinking about the idea of even thinking about truth in the natural world, and go back to Plato and look at the Socratic dialogues and see what's going on there. I think it's useful to see how people have thought about studying really the truth of reality. What is out there, and even the pagan Greek philosophers, I think, can be really helpful in thinking about these things. So that's just a few thoughts.
And how does Scripture help you interpret the world? One of the things I've been trying to argue is that while we need to be chastened in our claims about what a Christian worldview does for us, I am not at all prepared to abandon the category of a Christian worldview. And I'm convinced that there is a Christian interpretation of the world and a matrix of convictions through which which form a lens through which we do interpret reality and make truth claims and come to an understanding. How does Scripture then inform your worldview as you go to interpret scientific data and results?
Yeah. Well, so, one of the things that right off comes to mind as you say that is that I approach, because I'm studying the natural world. As a Christian, I'm already in a position where I'm saying I'm studying God's work. I'm studying what He has done. I'm studying what He has created. And so things like Psalm 19 and Psalm 8, shout out to me the joy of looking at the world, and recognizing the beauty and structure that is there as being fingerprints of God's work, as it were. And so, for encouragement for me, and so forth, I take heart in the fact that David even proclaims the beauties of the world as reasons to give praise to God, and so that part of my being is encouraged by those matters. But also as we've already been talking about, science is inherently a discipline that ought to be humble about what it concludes, because as a Reformed Christian, I recognize our own frailty. I recognize my own tendency to sin and problems with the way that I might interpret the world. But also, inherently being a finite creature, and knowing that Scripture definitely informs me of that fact and tells me that I need to submit all to Christ, I have to be tentative. I can't be proud about what we discover. I can't do anything but look at it and say, this is a little bit trite, but look at it and say, wow, that's pretty cool. And be really willing to change the way, if sufficient evidence comes along, to change the way that I've thought about this particular process or that particular structure, but never to claim too much. And again, we're operating in a time where that idea of science is it's really, at least in some circles, gone by the wayside, and we do try to claim too much, and that's a pity. But Scripture definitely holds me in check when it comes to that aspect of what I do.
Todd, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us and to help us walk through and work through some of these issues.
It's been a great pleasure to do so, and happy to continue the dialogue.
You've been listening to the Heidelcast. We've been talking to Dr. Todd Pedler, Associate Professor of Physics at Luther College. He is one of the co-hosts of a new podcast coming out next fall, and you want to look for that on iTunes. That's it for episode 68 of the Heidelcast.
That's the way it is.
Tune in next week.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe at heidelblog.net in iTunes or in your favorite podcast app like Podcruncher. Write to Heidelcast at heidelblog.net or on Twitter at rscottclark. Send us a message, and we may use it in a future broadcast. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2014, all rights.
Good night, Chet. And from Washington, thank you, and good night for all of us at NBC News.
Adjusting the Wayback Machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
You are listening to the Cavalcade of America, sponsored by the DuPont Company, makers of better things for better living through chemistry.
Among DuPont's better things for better living is DuPont neoprene rubber, used for many products and in a wide variety of ways. Recently, we heard of another interesting use of neoprene. A California couple developed a new household tool for polishing silverware. They used a block of DuPont neoprene because it is resistant to the oils and chemicals in silver polish, and because it contains no sulfur, which discolors silverware. In the block of DuPont neoprene, there are places for knives, forks, and spoons in which the silver polish is put, and the utensils rubbed back and forth. This unique use of DuPont neoprene is another example of how many new businesses have started with the help of the DuPont Company's Better Things for Better Living through chemistry.